He took my wife for a night. I'm taking his peace forever.
The first thing you need to know about electricity is that it takes the path of least resistance. The second thing is that when it finds a dead end, it builds up pressure until something explodes. I learned both lessons the hard way. My name is Dean Blakely, and I've spent 23 years fixing what other people break. Cars, mostly. Wiring harnesses, alternators, starter motors, the guts that make modern life possible. People bring me their problems wrapped in metal and plastic, and I solve them with my hands and a voltmeter. What I couldn't fix was my marriage. The warning signs had been there for months, like a check engine light nobody wanted to acknowledge. Melinda started staying late at the office 3 nights a week. Her phone developed a password. She bought new underwear, not for me. But the real tell was simpler than that. She stopped asking me to fix things. For 17 years, Mel had called me for everything. Dead battery, weird noise from the engine, flickering dashboard lights. I was her go-to guy, her personal mechanic, her husband who could make problems disappear with the right tool and enough patience. Then suddenly, she had other people for that. "I'll just call AAA," she'd say when her car wouldn't start. Or, "Seth knows a guy." Seth. That name had been cropping up in our conversations like a bad wire shorting out. Seth from her consulting work, Seth with the co-working space downtown, Seth who apparently knew guys for everything. I was replacing the alternator on Mrs. Henderson's Honda when my 17-year-old daughter Ivy dropped the bomb that changed everything. "Mom's at the loft again," she said, slouching against my workbench. Ivy had inherited my mechanical aptitude, but her mother's timing, both surgical and terrible. "What loft?" I asked, not looking up from the serpentine belt I was threading. You know, Mom's friend's place. "Seth's loft above his office." The wrench slipped in my hand. "Since when does your mother hang out at lofts?" Ivy shrugged with the casual cruelty of teenagers. "Couple months now." "She says they're working on some big project together." Right then, something clicked in my brain like a relay closing. All those late nights, all those new clothes, all those times she came home smelling like expensive soap instead of her usual lavender body wash. I finished the alternator replacement in silence while Ivy scrolled through her phone. But my mind was racing, calculating possibilities like an electrical diagram. Every marriage has its circuits: trust, communication, shared responsibility. When one circuit fails, the others have to carry more load. Eventually, something burns out. The question was, how badly? That night, Mel came home at 11:30 with takeout from that upscale Thai place she'd never shown interest in before. She moved through our kitchen like she was visiting a museum, touching things briefly before pulling her hand away. "How was work?" I asked from the couch, not looking up from the electrical manual I was reading. "Fine, busy." "You know how it is." I knew how it used to be. She'd tell me about difficult clients, zoning disputes, contract negotiations. Now I got fine and busy, like she was reading from a script. "Seth keeping you late again?" The slight pause before her answer told me everything. "It's not like that, Dean. We're launching something new. It requires focus." "What kind of something?" Another pause. "Consulting work." "You wouldn't understand." There it was, the condescension that had crept into her voice over the past year. Like I was too simple, too grease-stained, too working class to grasp the complexities of her new world. I understood plenty. I understood that marriages, like electrical systems, fail gradually and then all at once. I understood that my wife was lying to me with the same casualness she used to lie to difficult clients. And I understood that Seth, whoever the heck he was, had become the path of least resistance. The next morning, I made a decision that would have seemed paranoid 6 months earlier, but felt perfectly reasonable now. I installed a GPS tracker in Mel's car. Nothing fancy or illegal, just a diagnostic dongle that plugged into her OBD port, the kind mechanics use to monitor engine performance. Except this one also happened to track location and send updates to my phone. If anyone asked, it was preventive maintenance, making sure her transmission wasn't overheating. The transmission wasn't the only thing running hot, as it turned out. For 3 days, I watched Mel's daily routine play out on my phone screen like a soap opera plotted by satellites. Work, grocery store, yoga class, home, normal wife behavior. Then Thursday night happened. According to my phone, Mel's car was parked outside 412 Riverside Drive until 6:47 a.m. I looked up the address. Luxury loft conversion above a high-end co-working space called Synapse Collective. Monthly memberships starting at $800. Private offices with city views. Conference rooms named after dead philosophers. And according to the company website, it was owned and operated by one Seth Cranmore, age 31, MBA from Vanderbilt, specializing in disruptive consultation for next-generation entrepreneurs. The photo showed a guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a cologne ad, sharp jaw, perfect stubble, $1,000 haircut. The kind of man who'd never changed his own oil or fixed a leaky faucet. The kind who probably thought torque was a French cheese. But apparently he knew enough to torque my wife. I sat in my garage office staring at that photo until my coffee went cold. 23 years of marriage, and this was what it came down to. My wife spending the night with some startup consultant who looked like he belonged on a magazine cover instead of in the real world where things actually got built and fixed and maintained. The smart move would have been confrontation. Cards on the table, counseling, lawyers, all the civilized approaches to a failing marriage. But I'd never been particularly civilized. I was a mechanic. I fixed problems with tools and technique and stubborn persistence. And right now, I had a problem that needed fixing. First, I needed more information. Intelligence gathering, Louis would have called it. Louis Grant owned the junkyard where I sourced parts, and he'd done 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to inherit his father's business. He understood strategy. "You want my advice?" Louis said when I showed him the tracker data. We were standing in his office, a converted shipping container that smelled like motor oil and bad coffee. Cut your losses, half the assets, half the debt, move on with your life. "That's not advice," I said. "That's surrender." Louis grinned. He was built like a fire hydrant, short, thick, and capable of delivering tremendous pressure when needed. Surrender's what smart people do when they're outgunned. You want to know what stupid people do? Tell me. They get even. The plan started simple. If Mel was going to lie to me about her whereabouts, I'd make it easier for her to lie. I installed a second tracker in Seth's Tesla, midnight operation in the Synapse Collective parking garage. Me dressed like a maintenance worker with a clipboard and attitude. Amazing how invisible you become when you look like you belong somewhere. The Tesla was exactly what I'd expected. Pristine white exterior, beige leather interior, not a single coffee stain or food wrapper. This was a car that had never been truly lived in, never been a partner in someone's daily struggle. It was an accessory, like an expensive watch or designer shoes. I planted the tracker under the rear bumper with industrial adhesive. Now I could monitor both their movements independently, see when they met up, track their patterns. Knowledge was power, and power was what I needed. Over the next week, those patterns became depressingly clear. Seth's Tesla and Mel's Honda rendezvoused 3 times at his loft, twice at the Marriott downtown, and once at some vineyard 40 miles outside the city. Always when I was supposedly at work, always when Ivy was at school or friends' houses. They were careful, but not careful enough. Amateurs playing at espionage. On Friday night, I told Mel I was working late on a rush job, transmission replacement that couldn't wait until Monday. Instead, I drove to Riverside Drive and parked across the street from Synapse Collective. The building was all glass and steel, trying too hard to look important. Exposed brick, industrial lighting, the kind of aggressive trendiness that made everything look like a high-end furniture showroom. Seth's loft took up the entire 4th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows showing off a living space that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. I didn't have to wait long. Mel's Honda pulled into the garage at 8:23 p.m. She emerged 5 minutes later, looking like a different woman. Hair different, clothes I'd never seen, posture straighter. She moved with confidence I hadn't seen in years, like she was walking into her real life instead of away from it. Seth met her at the elevator. Even from across the street, I could see the way he touched her back, guided her with casual ownership. She leaned into him like she belonged there. I watched them disappear into the elevator, watched the lights come on in his loft, watched the silhouettes move behind gauzy curtains like actors in a play I wasn't invited to see. That's when I knew this wasn't just an affair. This was a replacement. I sat in my truck until midnight, watching their shadows dance against those perfect windows, and I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to threaten or plead or try to win her back. I was going to systematically dismantle both their lives, but first, I needed the right tools. "You want what now?" Louis asked when I visited the junkyard the next morning. "Something that can create a disturbance without leaving evidence. Car alarm modification, maybe?" something loud and disruptive, but completely legal. Louis studied me with the expression he used for evaluating scrap metal, calculating value versus effort. This about your wife situation? This is about applied electronics. He laughed. Applied electronics. I like that. He led me to a workbench covered with cannibalized car parts. I've been working on a project, started as a theft deterrent, but it got a little out of hand. What he showed me was beautiful in its simplicity. A modified car alarm system that could be triggered remotely via smartphone app. But instead of just honking the horn, it activated every electrical system simultaneously. Headlights strobing, windshield wipers thrashing, radio blasting at maximum volume, power windows cycling up and down. Drains the battery in about 15 minutes, Louis explained. But 15 minutes is long enough to wake up the entire neighborhood. Maybe crack some windows if the bass is turned up right. You've tested this? On my ex-wife's boyfriend's BMW. Worked like a dream. Perfect. The installation took me 2 hours of careful work in Seth's parking garage. Sunday morning, maintenance worker disguise again, clipboard full of official-looking nonsense. I spliced the modified alarm into his Tesla's existing electrical system, hiding the hardware behind the dashboard where nobody would think to look. From the outside, nothing had changed. But now, I held the power to turn Seth's pride and joy into a mechanical seizure whenever I wanted. The first test came Tuesday night. According to my tracking data, both cars were parked at the loft. I waited until 11 p.m., late enough that Seth's neighbors would be trying to sleep, early enough that they'd still be awake to hear the show. I opened the app on my phone and pressed the activation button. Even from 6 blocks away, I could hear it starting. The wail of the alarm, the thump of bass turned to destructive levels, the mechanical symphony of a car having a very public breakdown. It ran for exactly 14 minutes before the battery died. By then, I imagined Seth was standing in his expensive loft in his expensive underwear, trying to explain to his expensive neighbors why his expensive car was having a mechanical nervous breakdown in their expensive parking garage. But that was just the opening act. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered intelligence with the patience of a career mechanic, diagnosing an intermittent electrical problem. I collected evidence like spare parts, some big, some small, all necessary for the final assembly. Coffee shop loyalty card with Mel's name showing 17 visits to the cafe inside Seth's building. Parking receipts from the Marriott, always on days when she'd told me she was at the gym. A hotel pen in her purse with the Vineyards logo. Most damning of all, a notebook in her car's glove compartment filled with what could charitably be called romantic poetry, but realistically looked like the kind of thing people wrote when they were trying too hard to be profound. Your skin tastes like tomorrow, one entry read. In your arms, I remember who I used to be. Jesus. If I'd written something like that in high school, I'd have been laughed out of shop class. But the real breakthrough came from Ivy. I saw Mom kissing someone, she said one evening while I was replacing the spark plugs on her Honda Civic. She'd saved up for the car with money from her part-time job at the bookstore, and we'd been bonding over teaching her basic maintenance. When? I asked, not looking up from the engine. Last week. I was walking back from Emma's house and I saw Mom's car at that co-working place downtown. She was in the parking garage with some guy in a black shirt. They were definitely not talking about work. Black shirt. Seth's preferred uniform, according to his social media presence. The man had an entire Instagram devoted to his minimalist professional aesthetic, which apparently meant wearing the same black button-down in every photo. You okay with all this, kiddo? I asked. Ivy shrugged. I figured you already knew. You've been different lately, focused, like when you're working on a really complicated repair. Smart kid. Too smart, maybe. But she deserved better than parents who couldn't keep their marriage running smoothly. Your mom and I are having some problems, I said. But whatever happens, it's not your fault, and it doesn't change how either of us feels about you. I know. She wiped her hands on the shop rag. Just, when you fix it, don't make it worse, okay? That's when I realized my daughter was worried I'd do something stupid, something that would hurt her more than the situation already had. She was right to worry. The plan I'd been developing involved a level of systematic destruction that would make Sherman's March look like a neighborhood barbecue. But looking at Ivy, seeing her trying to hold everything together while her parents fell apart, I knew I had to be smarter, not nicer, smarter. The next phase required a different approach. Instead of attacking Seth and Mel directly, I decided to let them attack themselves. All I had to do was create the right conditions. I started with Seth's business. According to public records and his company's website, Synapse Collective was struggling. They'd launched 18 months earlier with big promises about revolutionizing collaborative workspace solutions, but were operating at a loss. Seth's consulting income kept the doors open, but barely. The company's biggest weakness was its image. They marketed themselves as cutting-edge innovators, but their client list was thin and their actual services were vague. They were one scandal away from collapse, so I gave them one. It took some planning. First, I needed to get Seth away from his loft during a time when Mel would be there. I created a fake client inquiry through a burner email account, claiming to represent a growing tech company that needed consultation on a major expansion. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop across town. While Seth drove to meet his non-existent client, I let myself into Synapse Collective. Not breaking and entering, I'd learned the door code by watching Seth punch it in during one of my surveillance visits. Amazing what you can see with a decent pair of binoculars and patience. The co-working space looked like every other startup fever dream. Exposed ductwork, Edison bulb fixtures, motivational quotes painted on brick walls. Disrupt everything. Fail fast, scale faster. Innovation never sleeps. What innovation apparently did do was leave its Bluetooth audio system unsecured and its security cameras running on default passwords. I spent 45 minutes installing a few modifications. Hidden Bluetooth receiver paired to my phone, capable of overriding the building's sound system. Wireless camera feeds rerouted to a cloud storage account I'd set up. Nothing illegal, just repurposing existing technology for enhanced functionality. By the time Seth returned from his disappointing meeting with a client who'd never existed, I was long gone. But I'd left him a few presents that would keep giving. The first activation came 3 days later during one of his private consultation sessions with Mel. I'd been monitoring the audio feeds from his loft, not to be a voyeur, but to gather intelligence. Their conversations were revealing in ways they probably didn't intend. Seth talked about my wife like she was a project he was working on, something that needed optimization and upgrade. Mel responded like a woman who'd been starved for attention and was finally getting fed. Dean doesn't understand ambition, I heard her say one evening. He's content to fix other people's problems instead of solving his own. That stung. But what stung worse was Seth's response. Men like him are threatened by growth. They want to keep you small because it makes them feel bigger. Men like him? As if 23 years of marriage and 17 years of fatherhood counted for nothing because I worked with my hands instead of pushing pixels around a computer screen. That's when I decided to give Seth's clients a real taste of his consultation style. Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of Seth's presentation to potential investors, I activated the building's sound system remotely. Instead of his carefully rehearsed pitch about synergistic collaboration solutions, the room was suddenly filled with audio from the previous night's session with my wife. God, you're so much more sophisticated than Dean, Mel's voice echoed from the speakers. He thinks a nice dinner is Applebee's and a movie. Seth's laughter followed. Small-town minds, small-town dreams. Some people are meant to be mechanics. Others are meant to build the future. The investors sat in stunned silence as 5 minutes of intimate conversation played out over the building's premium audio system. By the time Seth managed to shut it down, 3 of his potential backers had already left. The 4th one stayed long enough to tell him that his company's brand integrity had been compromised and they'd be withdrawing their offer. But that was still just the warm-up. The real show started 2 weeks later during the worst thunderstorm in a decade. I'd been tracking weather patterns like an engineer planning a controlled demolition. The storm system moving in from the west promised high winds, heavy rain, and enough electrical activity to mask what I had planned. Seth and Mel were at the loft, according to my GPS tracking. Cozy evening in, riding out the storm in his glass tower while the rest of us dealt with reality. At 11:47 p.m., with thunder shaking windows across the city and lightning turning the sky into a strobe light, I activated every modification I'd installed in Seth's Tesla. The car's alarm system didn't just activate. It exploded into life like a mechanical banshee. Horn blaring, light strobing, radio screaming at volumes that could crack concrete. Every electrical system cycling in a pattern that looked random but was actually carefully orchestrated to create maximum chaos. But this time, I'd added a special feature. The car's premium sound system was playing a greatest hits collection of Seth and Mel's more intimate conversations, broadcast at a volume that could be heard 6 blocks away. The Tesla's battery lasted 19 minutes before giving up completely. By then, Seth had run downstairs 3 times trying to shut it off, each time getting soaked by the storm. His neighbors were awake, angry, and recording everything on their phones. The audio quality was surprisingly good, even over the storm. Clear enough that anyone within earshot could hear Seth describing his boring neighbors, and Mel laughing about her clueless husband who probably thinks Bluetooth is a dental condition. By morning, videos of the incident were circulating on social media with hashtags like #louderthan_thunder and #TMITesla. Seth's professional reputation, already damaged by the investor meeting incident, took another major hit, but I was just getting started. The next phase required more subtlety. Instead of embarrassing them publicly, I decided to let their relationship destroy itself from within. Through my monitoring of their communications, I'd learned that Mel had told Seth she was considering leaving me. She'd painted our marriage as loveless and stagnant, herself as a victim of small-town thinking and limited imagination. What she hadn't told him was that we had significant joint assets. The house, the garage, 17 years of retirement contributions, Ivy's college fund. Divorce meant splitting everything down the middle, and my half included the business I'd built from nothing. Seth, meanwhile, had been telling Mel about his big expansion plans, new locations, nationwide franchise opportunities, the kind of growth that required significant investment. He was looking for a business partner with capital and vision. I decided to help them find each other. Using a shell company I'd established years earlier for tax purposes, I approached Seth with a business proposal. My fake company wanted to license his collaborative workspace methodology for a chain of locations across the Southeast. Initial investment, $200,000. Seth was interested, but cautious. He wanted references, financial statements, proof that we were legitimate. I gave him everything he asked for. Fake, but convincing financial documents, a business plan that looked professional enough to fool someone who wanted to be fooled, references to companies that existed but would never return his calls. Meanwhile, I was quietly liquidating joint assets. Not stealing, everything I touched was legally half mine. But I moved money from savings to checking to business accounts to investment vehicles that would be difficult to access quickly. When Mel finally told me she wanted a divorce, I was ready. "I think we need to talk about our future," she said over coffee one Saturday morning. Ivy was at a friend's house, and we had the kitchen to ourselves for the first time in weeks. "What about it?" I asked, not looking up from the newspaper. "I don't think this is working anymore, Dean. We've grown apart. We want different things." Such as... She'd rehearsed this speech, I could tell. Her words came out smooth and practiced, like a sales presentation. "I want to build something meaningful. I want to matter. I want to be with someone who shares my vision for the future." "Someone like Seth?" The coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. "How do you know about Seth?" "Hard not to. You've been spending half your time at his place for the past 3 months. She set the mug down carefully. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" What she wanted, it turned out, was a clean break. Amicable divorce, shared custody of Ivy, 50-50 split of assets. She had it all planned out, right down to which lawyer she wanted to use. "I've already talked to someone," she said. "We can do this without a lot of drama if we're both reasonable." Reasonable, that was the key word in her vocabulary now. Everything could be managed, optimized, solved with the right approach and proper planning. I agreed to everything she asked for. 2 weeks later, when the divorce papers were filed and she'd moved in with Seth temporarily while looking for her own place, I activated the final phase of my plan. The shell company that had been courting Seth suddenly had concerns about his business model. Our due diligence had revealed some troubling inconsistencies in his financial projections. We were withdrawing our offer and demanding return of the confidential information we'd shared. That confidential information included details about my real financial situation, specifically that Dean Blakely's auto repair business was considerably more profitable than it appeared, and that the modest mechanic, who seemed like such an easy target, had been systematically moving assets for months. Seth realized he'd been played about the same time Mel discovered that half of nothing was nothing. I'd followed the divorce agreement to the letter, 50-50 split of all marital assets, exactly as specified. The problem was that by the time the papers were signed, our marital assets consisted of the house, which had a second mortgage I'd taken out to expand the business, 2 cars, both with liens, and about $3,000 in checking accounts. Everything else, the real money, was in business accounts, investment vehicles, and trusts that predated the marriage or fell outside the scope of community property. Mel had left me for a man she thought was successful, only to discover that his business was failing and her soon-to-be ex-husband was considerably smarter than either of them had imagined. The first confrontation happened at Synapse Collective 3 days after she found out about the money. I was installing a new alternator on a customer's car when she stormed into my garage, still dressed in the expensive clothes she'd bought for her new life. "You bastard," she said. "You knew this whole time." I looked up from the engine compartment. "Knew what?" "Don't play dumb. You've been planning this for months. The money, the assets, all of it." "I've been protecting myself," I said. "Same as you." "This isn't protection. It's revenge." "No," I said, closing the hood with more force than necessary. "Revenge would be posting those videos of you and Seth online. Revenge would be sending copies of your private conversations to your mother. Revenge would be making sure everyone in town knew exactly what kind of woman you turned out to be." Her face went white. "You wouldn't." "I haven't. But that's not because I couldn't." She stared at me for a long moment, maybe seeing me clearly for the first time in months. Not the simple mechanic she'd outgrown, but a man who understood systems, how they worked, how they failed, and how to fix them when they broke. "Ivy hates you for this," she said finally. "No," I said, "she hates the situation. But she understands why it happened." That was true. Ivy had figured out the whole thing weeks earlier, watching me work with the focused intensity I usually reserved for complicated electrical problems. She didn't approve of everything I'd done, but she understood it. "You're a small, petty man," Mel said. "Maybe, but I'm a small, petty man who kept his promises, which is more than I can say for some people." She left without another word, but I knew this wasn't over. Mel had never been good at losing, and Seth struck me as the type who held grudges. I was right on both counts. The next attack came through Ivy. Seth, showing a level of stupidity that would have been impressive if it weren't so dangerous, tried to turn my daughter against me by explaining how her father had manipulated the system to steal from her mother. This was a mistake. Ivy had inherited my mechanical aptitude, her mother's intelligence, and a moral code that was entirely her own. When Seth cornered her after school to explain how terrible I was, she recorded the entire conversation on her phone and brought it straight to me. "I think we should consider legal action," Seth's voice said from the phone's speaker. "Your father has committed fraud on a massive scale. Your mother deserves justice." "My father followed the law," Ivy's voice responded, steady and sure. "Maybe you should have done your homework before getting involved with a married woman." "You don't understand the complexities." "I understand that you're a 31-year-old man trying to manipulate a 17-year-old girl into betraying her father. That's not complex, that's just creepy." The recording was damning, but more importantly, it was evidence that Seth had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. Going after my marriage was one thing. Going after my daughter was something else entirely. I paid him a visit that night. Synapse Collective was closed, but Seth was working late in his loft. The building's security had never been updated after my earlier modifications, so getting inside was simple. I found him at his standing desk, laptop open, surrounded by the kind of expensive minimalist furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. When he saw me in his doorway, his face went through several expressions before settling on nervous defiance. "This is private property," he said. "I could call the police." "You could," I agreed, stepping into the room. "But then you'd have to explain why you were approaching high school students with legal advice about their parents." He straightened, trying to look authoritative. "You were just being stupid," I interrupted. "But that's nothing new." "What is new is you involving my daughter in your midlife crisis." "Your wife came to me." "My wife made her own choices. But Ivy didn't choose any of this. She's 17 years old, trying to finish high school while her parents sort out their mess. And you thought it would be smart to drag her into it." Seth sat down in his expensive chair, maybe realizing that standing made him look more vulnerable. "Look, I know you're upset." "I'm not upset," I said. Upset is what happens when someone cuts you off in traffic. This is something different. I walked over to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights spread below. From up here, everything looks small and manageable, like a circuit board you could troubleshoot with the right tools. You know what I do for a living, Seth? You're a mechanic. I fix things that other people break. Cars mostly, but the principle is the same for everything. When something stops working the way it's supposed to, you diagnose the problem, identify the faulty component, and replace it. I turned back to face him. Your business is failing. Your investors pulled out. Your reputation is shot. That's not my fault. That's the market correcting itself, removing a faulty component. You sabotaged. I exposed. There's a difference. If your business was actually valuable, if your services were actually needed, none of what I did would have mattered. But you were selling vapor and calling it innovation, and eventually someone was going to notice. Seth's jaw tightened. Your wife saw through you. She knew you were small-minded and jealous, and my wife wanted someone to tell her she was special without putting in the work to actually be special. You were convenient. But here's the thing about convenience. It's temporary. I walked over to his desk, picking up one of his business cards. Synapse Collective, Collaborative Workspace Solutions. I looked at him. What does that actually mean? We provide... It doesn't mean anything. It's consultant speak for, I'll take your money and make you feel important while providing no actual value. The only thing you've successfully built is debt. At least I'm building something. At least I'm trying to matter. There it was, the core delusion that had made all of this possible. Seth genuinely believed that ambition was the same as value, that wanting something made you worthy of having it. You want to know what matters? I asked. Come here. I led him to the window, pointing down at the street below. See that traffic light? Someone wired that. Someone maintains it. Someone makes sure it works every day so people don't die in traffic accidents. See those streetlights? Same thing. The power lines, the phone cables, the internet infrastructure that lets you send emails about collaborative workspace solutions. Someone built all of that. Seth stared down at the street, not understanding where I was going with this. Those people don't get written up in business magazines, I continued. They don't give TED Talks about disrupting industries. They just show up every day and keep the lights on. Literally. And the world would collapse without them. I put the business card back on his desk. But you? The world would be exactly the same if you disappeared tomorrow. The only difference would be that my wife would have to find someone else to tell her she's special. Seth turned away from the window, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment, or both. You think you're so much better than me. No, I said. I think I'm more useful than you. And in the end, that's what matters. I walked toward the door, then stopped. Stay away from my daughter, Seth. Stay away from my family. Find yourself a new project, because this one is over. Is that a threat? I looked back at him. This expensively dressed man-child in his expensive loft, surrounded by expensive furniture that couldn't hide how small and empty his actual life was. It's advice, I said, from someone who fixes things for a living. Some problems can be repaired. Others need to be replaced entirely. I left him there, staring out his windows at a city full of people who actually mattered. But Seth, it turned out, wasn't smart enough to take advice. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later at the Mid-South Classic Car Show, an annual event that drew collectors and enthusiasts from across the region. I'd been attending for 15 years, usually as a spectator, but this year I had an entry. The '67 Mustang Fastback that Ivy and I had restored together over the past 6 months. It was beautiful work. Original 289 V8, 4-speed manual, candy apple red paint that looked like liquid fire in the sunlight. We'd done everything ourselves except the paint, working nights and weekends to bring a rusted Hulk back to life. Ivy was supposed to be there with me, but she'd come down with the flu the night before. So I was manning our display alone when Mel and Seth showed up. I saw them coming across the field, moving through the crowd of car enthusiasts like sharks through a school of fish. Mel wore a sundress I'd never seen before, something that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Seth was in his usual black shirt, but he'd added sunglasses and a watch that caught the light like a disco ball. They looked like people who'd gotten dressed up to attend their own execution. "Hello, Dean," Mel said when they reached our display space. Mel, Seth. I nodded to each of them without much enthusiasm. I didn't expect to see you here. We heard about your car, Seth said, looking at the Mustang with the expression of someone trying to appraise something he didn't understand. Nice work. Thanks. I kept my tone neutral, but I could feel the tension building like static electricity before a storm. Other people were starting to notice. Car shows attracted a specific type of crowd: mechanics, collectors, people who understood the difference between genuine craftsmanship and expensive accessories. They could sense drama the way mechanics could sense a failing transmission. I wanted to talk to you, Mel said, about Ivy. What about her? She's been distant lately, cold. I think you've been poisoning her against me. I laughed, a short bark that made several nearby visitors turn their heads. I haven't said a word against you to Ivy. I didn't need to. She figured it out on her own. Figured what out? Seth demanded. That her mother traded a family for a fantasy. That she threw away 17 years of marriage for a man whose biggest accomplishment is renting office space to other people who think they're entrepreneurs. Seth's face flushed red above his black shirt. You don't know anything about what I've built. I know it's not profitable. I know your investors bailed. I know you're 3 months behind on your lease payments and using a personal credit line to keep the lights on. The color drained from Seth's face. Those were details he wouldn't have shared with Mel, details that painted his successful business in a very different light. How could you possibly, he started, because I did my homework. Same as any smart person does before making a major decision. Too bad Mel didn't think to do the same. You spied on us, Mel said. You violated our privacy. I protected my interests. There's a difference. A small crowd was gathering now, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Car show drama was better than soap opera. Real people with real stakes playing out their conflicts against a backdrop of restored classics and chrome bumpers. You want to know what your husband really is? Seth said, raising his voice for the benefit of our audience. He's a vindictive little man who can't stand that his wife found someone better. Better? I looked Seth up and down, taking in the expensive clothes that couldn't hide his soft middle, the manicured hands that had never held a real tool, the watch. That cost more than most people's cars. Better at what? Spending money you don't have? Impressing women with borrowed sophistication? At least I have ambition. At least I'm trying to build something meaningful instead of just maintaining other people's mistakes. You want to talk about meaningful? Look around you. I gestured at the cars surrounding us. Dozens of classics, lovingly restored by people who understood the value of taking something broken and making it beautiful again. Every car here represents hundreds of hours of work. Real work with real tools, solving real problems. People brought these machines back from the dead because they mattered enough to save. I walked over to the Mustang, running my hand along the perfect curve of the fender. This car was rusted junk 6 months ago. Ivy and I rebuilt it from the ground up. New wiring harness, rebuilt engine, transmission, differential. We made something worthless into something valuable through skill and effort and patience. It's just a car, Seth said dismissively. Wrong answer. The crowd around us shifted, and I could feel their mood change. To car enthusiasts, saying, it's just a car, was like telling a parent their kid was just a child. It revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what mattered and why. It's just a car the same way the Mona Lisa is just a painting, said a voice from the crowd. Jim Patterson, a retired Ford engineer who'd been restoring classics for 40 years. Some people understand craftsmanship. Others just see objects. More voices joined in, a murmur of agreement that made Seth look uncomfortable for the first time since they'd arrived. This is ridiculous, Mel said. We didn't come here to debate car restoration. No, I said. You came here to continue a conversation that should have ended weeks ago. You left, Mel. You made your choice. Why are you still here? Because you stole from me. Because you manipulated the legal system to protect assets I spent 23 years building while you were figuring out what you wanted to be when you grew up? The crowd was getting larger, and their sympathy was clearly on my side. These were people who understood work, who respected skill and dedication. They could see Mel and Seth for what they were, tourists in the world of real accomplishment. You know what I think? I continued, my voice carrying across the display area. I think you're here because reality is setting in. You left your family for a man whose business is failing, whose investors have fled, whose only real asset is an overpriced loft that he can't afford much longer. Seth stepped forward, hands clenched into fists. You son of a— Careful, I said quietly. We're surrounded by witnesses, and assault charges would be the last thing your reputation needs right now. He stopped, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes. Good. Angry people made mistakes, and Seth had been making them all day. You want to know the truth about your boyfriend? I asked Mel. His business plan was based on finding a female partner with capital. Someone with assets he could leverage to expand his operation. He wasn't looking for love, he was looking for investment. Mel turned to look at Seth, and I saw doubt flicker across her face for the first time. That's not true. Ask him about the business proposal he sent to my shell company. Ask him about the $200,000 he thought he was going to get from Dean Blakely's soon-to-be ex-wife. Seth's face went white. You bastard. You set me up. I gave you exactly what you were looking for. A potential business partner with money. The fact that it turned out to be me just proves that you never bothered to do your due diligence. The crowd was completely on my side now. I could hear murmurs of appreciation for the complexity of the setup, the long-term planning it must have taken. These were people who understood complicated projects, and they could appreciate good work when they saw it. This is insane, Mel said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was starting to understand how thoroughly she'd been played, not by me, but by her own assumptions and desires. No, I said. Insane would have been staying married to someone who thought I was too stupid to notice she was cheating. Insane would have been letting you walk away with half of everything I'd built while you started a new life with money I'd earned. I opened the Mustang's hood, revealing the perfectly restored engine underneath. Every component was clean, properly maintained, functioning exactly as designed. This is what happens when you fix something properly. When you take the time to understand how it works and what went wrong. Our marriage wasn't a car engine, Mel said. No, it wasn't. Cars are simpler. When a car breaks, you can usually figure out why. When a marriage breaks, sometimes it's because one person decides the other person isn't good enough anymore. I closed the hood with a solid thunk that echoed across the display area. The difference is when I fix a car, it stays fixed. When someone breaks a marriage, you can't just replace the faulty component and expect everything to work like new. Seth grabbed Mel's arm. We don't have to listen to this. But Mel wasn't moving. She was staring at the Mustang, maybe seeing it for the first time. Seeing the work that had gone into it, the skill and patience and dedication required to bring something back from the dead. You did this with Ivy, she said quietly. Every weekend for 6 months. Taught her how to rebuild an engine, how to wire a harness, how to make something beautiful from something broken. She never told me. You never asked. You were too busy building your new life to pay attention to the old one. The crowd was starting to disperse, sensing that the main drama was winding down. But Jim Patterson stepped forward, looking at Seth with the expression mechanics reserve for people who brought them half-finished work done by amateurs. You said this was just a car, he said to Seth. You mind if I ask what you drive? A Tesla Model S. Jim nodded slowly. Computer on wheels. When it breaks, you take it to the dealer and they replace the whole module. No diagnosis, no repair, just replacement. He looked around at the classic cars surrounding us. These machines were built when people still fix things instead of throwing them away. Technology advances, Seth said defensively. Some things become obsolete. Like marriage? Asked a woman from the crowd. I didn't know her, but she was wearing coveralls and had grease under her fingernails. Like keeping promises. Like sticking with something when it gets difficult. Seth was outnumbered and outclassed, standing in the middle of a group of people who understood commitment and craftsmanship. His expensive clothes and designer accessories looked ridiculous here, like wearing a tuxedo to change a tire. We're leaving, he announced, tugging on Mel's arm, but Mel pulled away from him. No, I want to see the engine. What? The engine. I want Dean to show me what you and Ivy did. This wasn't what I'd expected. But I opened the hood again, pointing out the components we'd rebuilt, explaining the work that had gone into each system. Mel listened with an attention she hadn't shown me in months, asking questions that proved she was actually hearing what I said. The carburetor was completely gummed up, I explained. Had to be completely disassembled and rebuilt. The timing chain was stretched, valves needed adjustment, electrical system was a mess of spliced wires and corroded connections. How long did it take? 6 months of weekends? Maybe 200 hours total. Ivy did most of the detail work. She's got better eyes than me for close work. She's good at this? She's got natural talent. Better than mine, if I'm honest. She understands how systems work together, how changing one thing affects everything else. Mel nodded slowly, maybe understanding that she'd missed something important while she was busy planning her escape. This car will run for another 50 years if it's properly maintained, I continued. That's the difference between fixing something right and just replacing it with something new. Are we talking about cars or marriages? She asked. I'm talking about both, but you made your choice about which one was worth saving. Seth stepped between us, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Mel, we need to go. This is just him trying to manipulate you again. No, she said, still looking at the engine. This is him showing me what I walked away from. A grease monkey with delusions of... He never finished the sentence. Mel turned on him with a fury I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage, when she still cared enough to fight for things that mattered. Don't you dare, she said. Don't you dare minimize what this represents. This is real work, real skill, real achievement, something you've never understood because you've never built anything that wasn't made of words and wishful thinking. Seth's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Around us, the remaining crowd watched with the fascination of people witnessing a public execution. Your whole business is smoke, Mel continued, her voice rising. Your loft, your clothes, your car, it's all borrowed money and projected success. You don't actually make anything or fix anything or contribute anything. You just rearrange other people's ideas and call it innovation. That's not... And I fell for it. I fell for the fantasy because I was bored and stupid and wanted someone to tell me I was special. But you know what's actually special? This? She gestured at the Mustang, at the other restored classics surrounding us. People who take broken things and make them better. People who build something that lasts. Seth looked around desperately, maybe hoping for support from the crowd. But these were mechanics and engineers and craftspeople, and they'd heard enough to know exactly what kind of man he was. You're making a mistake, he told Mel. You're throwing away your future for what? For a man who kept his promises? For a daughter who actually respects her parents? For a life that's built on something real instead of something I imagined? Seth's face went through several emotions before settling on cold calculation. Fine. Go back to your small life with your small man, but don't come crawling back when you realize what you're giving up. What am I giving up, Seth? A failed business? Debt I didn't create? A man who sees relationships as investment opportunities? He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd like a man fleeing a burning building. His expensive watch caught the sunlight one last time before he disappeared between the rows of classic cars. Mel and I stood in awkward silence for a moment, surrounded by strangers who were trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a marriage dissolve and potentially resurrect itself in the space of 20 minutes. So, she said finally, what happens now? I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was older than the woman I'd married, marked by the same years that had marked me. But under the expensive clothes and careful makeup, she was still the person who'd chosen to spend her life with a mechanic because she believed in building something together. That depends, I said. Are you asking because you want to know or because you think you should want to know? She smiled, a real smile, not the practiced expression she'd been wearing for months. I want to know. I want to understand what I broke and whether it can be fixed. I closed the hood of the Mustang, the sound echoing across the field like a door closing on one chapter and opening on another. Some things can be rebuilt, I said. But it takes time and work and a commitment to doing it right. And both people have to want the same outcome. What outcome do you want? I looked around at the car show, at the families walking between displays, at the kids getting their first glimpse of what real craftsmanship looked like. I want to build something that lasts, something that my daughter can be proud of, something that matters. Mel nodded slowly. That sounds like something worth working toward. It won't be easy. Trust is like a wiring harness. Once it's damaged, you can't just patch it. You have to replace the whole system. I know. And I know I'm the one who damaged it. Jim Patterson approached us, holding a clipboard and trying to look official. Sorry to interrupt, but we need to finish the judging. Mind if I take a closer look at your restoration work? For the next hour, we talked to judges and spectators, explaining the work that had gone into bringing the Mustang back to life. Mel listened more than she spoke, but when she did contribute, it was clear she understood what she was seeing. When they announced the winners, our Mustang took first place in the Modified Classic category. The trophy was a small thing, just engraved metal and plastic, but it represented something larger, recognition for work done right, for time invested wisely, for creating something beautiful from something broken. Ivy's going to be sorry she missed this, Mel said as we loaded the trophy into the car. She'll see it when we get home, and there'll be other shows, other opportunities to display what we've built together. Mel was quiet for a moment. Will there be room for me in those future plans? I thought about that question while the last of the car show crowd dispersed around us, people heading home to their own projects and responsibilities and relationships that needed tending. That depends on whether you're willing to do the work, I said finally. Real work, not just good intentions and wishful thinking. Rebuilding something that's been broken takes patience and skill and absolute honesty about what went wrong. I'm willing, she said, if you are. I looked at the Mustang, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like a promise kept. 23 years of marriage, 17 years of parenthood, 6 months of systematic destruction and careful rebuilding. Some things were worth saving, worth fighting for, worth the effort it took to make them whole again. Yeah, I said. I'm willing to try. We drove home together in the Mustang, the trophy rattling softly in the back seat, the engine purring with the satisfaction of a machine that had been properly restored. It wasn't the end of our story, but it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so beautiful that everyone can see what they almost lost. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very skilled and very patient, you get the chance to rebuild more than just machines. You get the chance to rebuild a life.